History in the making. President Obama about to leave for Cuba. We will hear from our crew in Havana live about the preps and expectations.
They will not change any one of the principles of their regime.
Divided lines, there is opposition and there is support for the president's trip in the Cuban American community. We will have that debate.
The fact is, we have to bring our party together. We have to bring it together.
Donald Trump says it's time to unify the GOP and that he's the one who can do it. Party leaders have other ideas. We will take it to the roundtable.
Good morning and welcome. In just a few hours, President Barack Obama is set to become the first sitting U.S. president to visit Cuba in almost 90 years.
This trip caps more than a year of seismic change in the relationship between the U.S. and Cuba. No other community feels that change as deeply as ours, the heart of a Cuban exile for more than half a century.
And our team is in Havana this week, reporting on the preparations and the expectations.
And we have a chance to connect with him this morning. And there you see on the left, Victor Oquendo. In the middle, our friend Calvin Hughes. Well, they're all our friends. And Hansel Bella there on the right. Gentlemen, good morning. Great to see you there.
Good morning. Buenos dias from Havana, Michael and Glenna. And, you know, we are here right now, but we understand that there's some breaking news off the top that we want to tell you about. And our Hansel Bella has been on top of that one.
Well, we've been really in touch with the dissidents here on the island. I just got off the phone with Berta Soler, who tells me she was on her way to her normal every Sunday march that's happening in Miramar. And we are told by one of our photographers who's in that area that at least one journalist was arrested. At this point, we're not sure. We do know that he was a uncredentialed journalist. So everybody here, if you're press, you carry one of these around. So it could have been that that person may not have been carrying this around. This gives you sort of access to do whatever you need to do. But at this point, one uncredentialed journalist arrested. Typically that means, Calvin, that these are folks, journalists who work locally and they're what they called independent journalists.
Yeah. Interesting to hear too, we heard from the chief photographer who Hansel just referred to, William Damas. He is there in Miramar in front of the St. Rita's Church, and in fact he said that the procession that they normally take outside is happening on the inside, the march at the Damas de Blanco, or Ladies in White, take. And that's something that we know is very important because back in September it didn't quite happen when the Pope was here.
That's exactly what we were waiting for that Sunday, because they do march every single Sunday. We were waiting for them to march when the Pope was here. That one though, I believe 25 people were arrested. We're hoping to march the Ladies in White. So we do have a photographer there following this one very closely for us. We can tell you that before his trip down here, President Obama did send a letter to Berta Soler, the leader of the Ladies in White, kind of supportive,
yes,
saying that he wants to speak with her and understand exactly what it is that they're going to try to fully grasp the situation here.
I think what's important to remember too is oftentimes we get the question when we come back in Miami of whether or not we're actually able to talk with whomever we like, and this is your second time here. Have you ever had any issue talking with anyone here in Cuba?
It's incredible how often we get this question. Let's make this clear. At no point has anyone ever told us who we can talk to, who we can't talk to, what we can shoot, what we can't shoot. Nobody dictates our coverage here. Our access has not been impeded in any way, so we want to make that clear. Once again, just so that everybody knows, we kind of go our own way here. Now, after the fact, people do watch our coverage once we're on the air, but nothing is determined before.
Well, the proof is that every time we've been here since January of 2015, we've been able to talk to dissidents every time without any hassles.
And keep in mind, Communist Cuba remains one of the most repressive governments on the planet, not to mention they have a very tight grip on information and communication here. You've spoken with one of the most prominent dissidents here on the island, Antonio Rediles, and when we first arrived here on Thursday, you had a chance to talk with Antonio Rediles as well. What did he have to say?
Yeah, we sat down, we had a conversation about 30 minutes, and really we wanted to know whether he was going to be attending that meeting with the President of the United States. He said he had been invited to some sort of high-level meeting. He didn't say, or he wasn't told whether it was going to be with the President, but he did talk about some of the things he wanted to get across if he had the chance to speak with the President. Here's what he said. What do you say to him?
I will tell to him that Cuba need to be respected. Cuba need to be free. Well, I think that the main point here in Cuba right now is the topic of the human rights and the promotion of democracy. If we don't have freedom, you cannot talk about anything. Even the situation now is worse than before.
How?
Because they are more violent. We Cubans also have a dream, and our dreams is freedom.
What do you hope his visit accomplishes?
To open a way for the freedom of Cubans.
All right, that is Antonio Rodiles, one of the dissidents who may be meeting with President Obama. He gave us a list of other folks he thinks may be there as well. But the big question remains, will all these dissidents be able to make it to that meeting on Tuesday?
We also heard from a top government official from Cuba as well yesterday.
And this is all ahead of the president's arrival, which, as we want to keep reminding you, just hours away at this point. Let's listen here now from Josefina Vidal.
We can speak frankly and openly about the differences of conceptions that we have, but not with the pretension that we will change you or you will change us, because it will be finally up to our populations, which are sovereign, to decide what kind of model, what kind of government they consider is better for them.
Josefina Vidal, the top Cuban government negotiator back in January when the talks began to normalize relations. For the U.S. government, it was Roberta Jacobson. So let's briefly talk about the president's schedule right now. We know where he's going to go after he lands here, just around 4:50 this afternoon.
It is a tight schedule. He will head right to the U.S. Embassy. That is his first stop. He will meet with staffers there, and then he's headed to Old Havana.
And that's where I think he's going to get a tour, not just of the older part of the city, but he's also expected to then visit the cathedral, where he is expected to meet with Cardinal Jaime Ortega. As you know, he has been crucial, him and Pope Francis, in these negotiations.
Yeah, Michael and Glenna, we know that the church played a major role in bringing these two nations together, old foes, and that U.S. embargo, by the way, remains intact, and that's something that the president, he can come over here and he can say a lot. He can make a lot of promises, but that's one thing that he cannot overturn. Michael, as you know, that'll take an act of Congress.
It will indeed, and in fact, I got an email yesterday from Congressman Mario Diaz-Balart of Miami, who in scathing terms said, Mr. President, you can do some things, but you can't overturn the embargo unilaterally. And of course, Congress doesn't seem inclined to do that, Glenna, before the election in November.
Gentlemen, can I go back to the issue of the press? I know Hatzel was talking about, he spoke with Berta Soler. There was an arrest of an uncredentialed journalist, apparently. I want to let you know, last time that I was there, we spoke with the Ministry of Interior representative, who was absolutely floored that American press can say anything they like on the air as long as it's correct, as long as it's factual, and as long as it's fair. This is such a foreign concept to press in Cuba, and I wonder, do you know if there is control of the press, no doubt, whether you've seen it in a nuanced way or not. Have you seen any people who feel like they were not credentialed and had to go without credentials? Do you know about numbers of who in the press they're allowing in, allowing to be free?
Well, I think when you talk about the press, there's certainly differences between American press and the rest of the press. What we can tell you, Glenna, is that we understand, and talking to folks here on the ground, is that even the Cuban press, as we've been told by folks who live here and practice journalism day in and day out, they're telling us that even the Cuban press is now being given more flexibility in what issues they report, which is, as you mentioned, unprecedented. So not only are we being given some access, but also they're changing the tone in what they report, which is it's amazing to see.
And let me sort of advance that a little bit. We know there's a news conference that's going to take place between the President Raul Castro and President Obama. The question is, will the press be able to ask open questions? We're going to find that out, of course, and we have you covered every step of the way. From my colleague here, Victor Aquendo, Hatzavella, Michael and Glenna, we'll send it back to you from Havana.
And we will look forward to your reports this afternoon, tomorrow, Tuesday. We are glad our team is there in place.
Absolutely, and the president's trip is being watched so intently here in South Florida, a community with deep personal stake in the outcome, and we will talk all about that when we come right back. The president's arrival in Havana today caps 15 months worth of changes and renewed relations between the United States and Cuba.
And South Florida's Cuban-American community obviously is watching intently on the edge of their chairs as it were, and they have mixed reactions, I think, and we're going to talk about that today with our guests. They include Alex Barreras, founding member of Cuba Now, an organization that advocates for paving the way for better opportunities for the U.S. and Cuba relations. He grew up in Cuba. He is an advertising executive now in Miami. Mariely Cancio is a Miami attorney active in Hispanic affairs and also in the Republican Party. And Dr. Andy Gomez is a retired professor from the University of Miami Institute for Cuban and Cuban American Studies. He recently traveled to Cuba for the visit of Pope Francis. To all of you, good morning.
Good
Morning.
morning. Thanks for being here.
Great to have you come in. So, Andy Gomez, is this visit simply for the president's legacy, or will this really be able to achieve something?
Well, Michael, it's bittersweet because, less than 48 hours ago, we saw 9 Cubans drown in the ocean trying to find freedom.
Yeah.
3 popes have gone to Cuba, and after they've left, very little has happened. There is change going on in Cuba, but change still lacks a definition. The President of the United States going to Cuba, I think it's a little bit premature because I don't think Cuba has basically put much on the table in terms of not only diplomatic relations, but a long process of normalization. What President Obama, I think the most important issue is going to be what President Obama says to the dissidents and to the Cuban people.
And that is all on Tuesday. I mean, Mariely, there's lots of lead up to what we're going to see on Tuesday, but that is when he meets with the dissidents and then he goes on Cuban state TV. That's the big moment.
And then he watches a baseball game and catches a plane and leaves. So my position is that the dissidents have suffered tremendously in the last 15 months.
Yeah.
My position is similar to Dan Le Batard when asked why he didn't go. And he says, only if you're from Miami, you can understand why I am not going. Emilio Estefan, when he got off the plane this week after going to the White House with several leaders that are in Cuba, he says, I cannot go yet because there have been not enough changes. So what we've seen is 8,000 arbitrary arrests last year, over 2,200 arrests in January and February of this year, and just in March, in a 2-week period, over 600 arrests of Cubans. The government, the official communist newspaper, Granma, said there's no human rights abuses in Cuba, otherwise Obama wouldn't be coming here. They had Maduro go to Havana on Friday night, 2 days before Obama's visit, to make a point that they're not changing their ideological beliefs.
Well, it's true. There are a host of things that have happened that mitigate against anything meaningful coming out of this, but Alex Barreras, in fact, it's still possible that something good can come out of this.
I think a lot of good things will come out of the visit, and I agree that it's a perspective that is mostly unique to Miami. I think outside of Miami, and especially in Cuba, the visit is supported. The visit is something that the Cubans in Cuba desire. They have been pining for it, and I think it's a hugely symbolic move that removes away the argument of Cuba as of the hostility of the U.S. I think it takes away their enemy that if you grew up in Cuba, it had been taught to you since you were little, and that for Cubans in Cuba, that is the catalyst they need to continue pushing for that change that is coming. It might not be coming at the speed they want, but it's definitely coming.
Although, was it a year ago or 15 months ago, the president had said he will not travel himself to Cuba until there is, I think the words he used was substantive change. Andy Gomez, there has been really no substantive change on the Cuba side. So why did the president decide to now go?
Even though I disagree with his strategy, I understand his strategy. Since JFK, every president, Republicans and Democrats, have put conditions on the Cuban governments before coming together. This White House decided, Glenna, let's take all the conditions off and let's see what happens. My concern of this is that economic interest is driving the changes, and by economic reforms don't necessarily bring about what we can call democratic changes in Cuba.
But Andy, isn't that in a sense essentially the premise of the Obama administration philosophy is if we open up commerce and trade and travel, once the toothpaste of democracy is out of the tube, Castro can't put it back in, so that there will be inevitable change.
Your own colleagues, Calvin and Hassel, on their first report Friday, they asked a number of Cubans on the street, just like I did when I went for the Pope Francis's visit. But Calvin and Hassel asked, are you better off today than you were prior to establishing a relationship with the United States? And most of the people that they interviewed said no. The only ones that have seen positive change are those that have access to tourism dollars or work in the tourism sector, which is the minority of Cubans on the island.
Although
But
now,
but the same token, in the poll conducted by Ben Dixon in Cuba last year, 78% of Cubans believe that the engagement policy will lead to economy to development of the economic system. Now that doesn't happen overnight again, but we're seeing more licenses, more private licenses, more people working on the private sector, and engagement helps those people and empowers those people.
The banking changes, especially this week. Now you have hard dollars and credit that's able to be extended.
Let's talk about hard dollars. We were speaking off camera before. The Miami Herald, when they went to Pope Francis's visit, they paid $1,000 for a 2-star hotel room. Where does that money go? Where the average wage is $20 a month. We are helping the Cuban government. We've seen in our policy change with Cuba over 100,000 new tourists to the island. We haven't seen anything related to democracy or better human rights. So we're going to have like a China next door. Because in China, they have a great economy, but they have no rights.
But at the same time, Marili, I agree with your concept. You can't isolate a country, particularly an island, as long as we have, and expect change. And change has got to come from
what do you mean they're isolated? They're not isolated.
Let me finish. You talked about the ideology. The ideology with Yogar, Raul, and others has not changed. In '91, professors from the University of Havana published an article in their own magazines that they were concerned that the ideology was being lost. Today's young Cubans, those that we've seen trying to leave and cross and get to the United States via Central America, don't believe anymore in that ideology.
They don't believe in anything.
And
they don't believe
dangerous.
in anything because I had my nails done yesterday by a 23-year-old that came 3 years ago from Cuba, and I asked her, I says, her mom is still in Santa Clara, and I says, what do you think of Obama's visit? She says, we don't talk about that in the island. Yeah. Nobody's involved in politics. They haven't had elections since 1959.
I think it's asking too much for people who grew up in a one-party system on the communist to be as knowledgeable as politics as we understand them in the U.S.
And there is not a free media. And as A.J. Lieveling, the great press critic, once said, the press is free as long as you own one.
Right.
The only person who owns the press is the Cuban government.
I spoke with Ben Rhodes when he was here last week. I had like 2 minutes alone with him, and I said really quickly, because I wasn't invited to the main meeting with the folks that
with Ben Rhodes and the others? Yeah.
No, I wasn't invited to that one. It was at Miami-Dade College, and as a privilege of being a trustee, I went to the first meeting with the students, and I asked him,
I saw you there.
Is he meeting with Fidel? No, he's not. Is he meeting with Ladies in White? Yes, he is. And I said, we need more internet and communication in the island, because as long as they control it, nothing is going to change.
And that's what I mean. You can't isolate them.
Let's pick up there when we come right back from this quick break.
Yeah.
We are back and want to pick up where we left off before the break. We're talking about the president's trip to Cuba. Alex Barreras, during the commercial, when we have sometimes our best conversations, we were talking about when you left Cuba to come here in the mid-'90s, right in the middle of the special period, and you came because to put the headline, you were hungry.
Absolutely.
What was really interesting to us sitting here was that you didn't really have a concept of what freedom meant.
Yeah, we had an idea of what is freedom, democracy, multi-party elections, even being involved politically. We had an idea. In fact, we rejected that because politics in Cuba was communist politics, and so we didn't want to be a part of that.
So right now you have 11 million or so people. Yeah. The mass majority of them have grown up knowing nothing but what they
9 million born since
think-
1959.
So what
I
does
think
that
the key-
mean for change?
Yeah,
What
I think the key
practically
argument there is that politics starts, in my opinion, by empowering, right? And by empowerment, and in Cuba, that has to start by economic empowerment, by giving those 11 million people a way to see a better opportunity that they can do inside their country. Let's be realistic. The changes in Cuba are not going to come from the U.S. They're not going to come from us. They're going to come internally. If those people are not empowered, if those people don't get access to more communications, more internet, which is already happening, and they need to push them, if those people don't get access, contact with people in the U.S. that can show them that there's a better way to do things, then we are not going to get the change that we want. And that's what we're trying to
But
do.
the danger of empowerment for the government in power
Right.
is to lose political control. If the economic might of the United States is not going to change that. If the Cuban government really wants to empower the Cuban people, let's begin by raising their salaries from $24 a month. Let's double it, so they can have the purchasing power to participate on what American economic might be able to
On
do.
on that point, Carlos Rodriguez of the Cuba Study Group, who is in Cuba with the president, he told me this week that since 2011, 400,000 licenses have been granted to cuentas propistas, the small business people. I mean, sometimes it's, fixing lighters, cigarette lighters, or repairing shoes, whatever it is. But nevertheless,
Riding your bicycle, being a little taxi, right?
All right,
So
but-
each of those
but-
licenses cost money, and they have to pay the government,
right?
and they
but
have no
they
rights.
but Maria Lee, the point is whether
They can withdraw the license.
That is-
they
but
have no legal right.
but
That is-
it is they are self-sustaining. They're not relying on the $24.
Absolutely,
a month.
and there's some estimates that as much as 40% of the Cuban labor force now works for either the private sector or the gray market. And to me, each Cuban that doesn't depend of their salary from the government is a Cuban that is more empowered to ask and advocate for that change that they want. They're going to be asking for more opportunity that eventually will become political opportunity.
Well, this is the 20th anniversary of the Brothers to the Rescue shoot down of those planes. Nobody went to jail, so we're rewarding the Cuban government by legitimizing them, by going there, shaking their hands and saying, good job, we're here, big smiles. While they have the little souvenirs, with Obama and Raul Castro, next to it they say, we will never give up. Because the revolution and their ideas are going to continue being the same. And while we legitimize them, what we're saying to the dissidents and to the people is like, this is the government that you have to answer to.
Do you think that will continue? I mean, the
No.
Castros are in their 80s.
No.
I mean, with respect
No.
to
He's going to step
humanity
down
to
in
them.
2018, supposedly.
Do
Well,
you
he's
think
84 years old right now. If he gets
Eventually,
to
Well, they're supposed to have elections.
2018,
He'll step
and so-
down. He'll pass it to
Or pass
somebody,
away.
Diaz-Canel, even though it's never been safe to be the third person in Cuba, as we
Right,
all know.
exactly.
Or a military person.
or his son-in-law, or his
Well,
son.
we'll have to wait. We'll have to wait what happens April 16th.
And so, with the internet in place, although we learned
Very
this morning
limited.
5% of the people have access to it, but with all of these
Right.
little economic changes, with the flood of American business that is there now, even with the embargo in place, is there a thinking that
Well,
this is the start
let me-
of an eventual change?
A young man that I sat with in Cuba that finally had access to the internet and started getting some information turned to me. You know what he asked me? What happened to Yugoslavia? So
Wow.
that group of people is like feeding a baby. You can't give them too much information too quickly; they're going to choke, and that's the problem. Change has got to come gradually. Cuba is not ready for a democracy today, and I dare to say it will not be ready for a democracy in 5 years.
Well,
we didn't have a democracy in '58.
Yeah. The other thing that apparently American companies are chafing to get in there, and they have discovered that, in fact, the Cuban government, it just does not move fast.
No.
I mean, they're inept, and they haven't been able to get contracts, although I did note that AT&T, Carnival Cruise Line, Starwood Hotels,
Airbnb.
all say that they are ready to sign
the
deals.
Starwood
And
Hotel
this-
is going to be managing 3 hotels in the island, hotels that were appropriated from U.S. entities before. So meanwhile, we have in the island people that fled the U.S. that have killed police officers. We have people that have milk our Medicare system, none of those things have been addressed. So I think it's immoral to do business with the Cuban government, because if you do business in Cuba, you're doing business with the Castro family.
And Star Wars Hotel will also be providing employment for Cubans in Cuba. It will also be providing economic growth, which eventually benefits the Cuban people. And I think one of the areas, and I don't think it's a coincidence that the first deal under the new rules was the establishment of a tractor factory in Cuba, because the agricultural sector is one where we're going to see
tractor assembly
a lot
factory
of,
at the port of Mariana.
And we're going to see in the agricultural sector a lot of growth, and that has been a sector that has been neglected by the current government, and where the private sector has an opportunity to show the Cuban people that they are the ones who can provide food.
Right. Well, you know, just to button this up, one of the big questions right now, and maybe the president will raise it in the private meetings, is any foreign company that does business in Cuba, you know this obviously very well, Mary Lee, has to, its employees are provided by the Cuban government.
Correct.
The Cuban government gets paid in euros or dollars, and they pay in CUCs, in the cheap Cuban currency, to the employees. And a stumbling point for American companies is being able to say, I want to hire Jose or Maria or whatever. They cannot hire their own employees right now.
Yes, and they are pushing for that change, by the way. And that is a change from that it used to be in 10 years. 10 years ago, they used to pay in Cuban pesos. Now you're paying COCs, and they're pushing for more changes on labor law.
The bottom line in this whole thing is, for 58 plus years, the policies that we have had in place have not worked.
Absolutely.
As painful as it is, and it is painful for me to see some of this, we have to look at something else. I'm not saying that this is the right policy. Let's see what happens.
And I agree that the normalization policies that need to change is between the Cuban government and its people. It's not between us and them. It's between the Castros and the Cubans.
And that is the last word.
That is the last word. We are out of time, but thank you all for
we will be watching
the discussion that I hope we would have. So thank you all very much. Okay. Up next, we're going to take it to the round table.
We have a lot on the plate for this week's roundtable, which includes some familiar faces and today a first-timer.
Ed Pizzoli is an attorney in Fort Lauderdale, president of the Tripp Scott Law Firm, active in Republican Party politics locally and nationally. Henry Crespo is president of the Democratic Black Caucus of Florida. He also hosts a radio program. And new to the roundtable, we are glad to welcome Millie Herrera, founder of the Miami Group consulting firm. She is active in the Democratic Party and has extensive experience in business and labor. Millie,
good
welcome.
Morning.
Great
Good
to
morning.
have you
Thank
here.
you. Great to be here. Thank you.
Exciting. All right, so Ed Pizzoli, looking at the president's trip, do you have any expectations that this is going to make any change in Cuba?
No, and I think it's overplayed. The president should not go down there while the Cubans have not moved at all on human rights or impacted the lives of their citizens or opened up freedoms. But, you know, I guess they're going to go down for a good ball game and come home.
So his own statement in December to Yahoo News when he said, I want to go when there has been substantive, as Glenna quoted him earlier, substantive improvement in human rights, that should have been the standard.
Well, that was the standard set by President Obama, but clearly, like other things we've seen out of the Obama administration, the line was drawn and then erased. And then, you know, he decided that this was more important from a legacy perspective, his own legacy, not really in changing the life and the opportunities for the Cuban people.
You know, it was interesting.
Well, Millie, jump in.
Yeah, no, I think it's really important that he go. I disagree, respectfully disagree. I think that it can be life-changing. It can, you know, he can nudge. And yes, he said he would go when there was substantial change, and it hasn't happened. So he's going over there to nudge him. And I think that you need to sit down with your adversaries. It's important to sit with your adversaries and say, listen, let's negotiate. You told me you were going to do this, and you're allowing the hardliners on the island, because they're hardliners on the island, just like they're hardliners here. They're allowing the hardliners to still hijack the change that needs to happen in Cuba. So yes, you need human rights, advocacy, and actually action in Cuba, freeing the political prisoners, allowing the Cuban people to breathe, to be able to be in a round table like this on a daily basis and talk about, listen, I don't like the way things are going in Cuba. And that, it needs to happen.
You know, Cuba is a big issue in South Florida. But nationwide, you know, the president's coming to his end of his tenure, Henry. There's so many crises around the world. Cuba is really not that significant in the big scheme of things to the United States national interests. Why there and why now?
Well, as it relates to the American psyche overall, I think other than Big Line in Union City, I think that Cuba is a major discussion ever since 1966 when John Gilbert passed or introduced the Cuban Adjustment Act, Democrat, out of New York, plus got passed by LBJ, President, Democrat in D.C. So they have a lot to thank the Democratic Party on that. But to your point on the...
Ed, you feeling a little outnumbered here at the moment?
Yeah, I got to point that in there.
No.
But the point of...
I think he makes a great point, by the way.
But the point of this movement in Cuba, he mentioned it in 2008 when he came to the Omni. He spoke at the Cuban American Foundation where Marco Rubio spoke before him and had to leave. And he spoke about having some discourse with Cuba. And I think this is the right time.
Well, he's been talking, the president has been talking about Cuba for a long time in the greater scheme of world affairs. It is not that important, but to us in South Florida, it is critical. We've got 1 million or so Cubans, Cuban Americans here, and of whom Millie Herrera is one and proud to be.
That are divided on the issues.
And Henry
They are
Cusco,
divided.
and they are divided. Well, as a matter of fact, to show you how divided, I've got, this week I went out and I spoke to 2 prominent Cuban Americans, one pro, one con, and I want to play the soundbite and get your comments on it. The first is a woman named Sylvia Iriondo, who is part of something called the Mothers Against Repression. She was on the only surviving plane when the Brothers to the Rescue were shot down. The second sound is with Carlos Saladrigas of the Cuba Study Group. Let's play that sound now.
When I see him, President Obama, with his family, walking through Old Havana, like so many people have done before him, tourists and the like, I will think of the countless numbers of families that were uprooted, separated, their lives destroyed, not because of the United States, but because of the Castro regime.
His mission is to open up the doors and windows to the forces of change. From 2011 to 2016, over 400,000 people have gotten licenses, and they have, in those short years, they have employed 40% of the Cuban workforce. Isn't that amazing?
You know, watching Sylvia Iriondo, it strikes me that, and Mary Lee actually brought it up in the last segment, Raul Castro, the Castro regime admitted ordering the shoot-down of the Brothers to the Rescue planes. There is an indictment. What happens when the president looks at Raul Castro? Does he think of that? Is there anything about maybe a future Raul Castro trip to the U.S. when he touches soil? Will he be arrested? Doesn't that have to be at top of mind?
I'm sure that there are going to be some very, very intense conversations. Watching and knowing President Obama, he seems very calm on the outside, but I think that he is going to give him an invoice saying, like, hey, listen, these are the things that need to happen. You need to move. You need to start making some real changes. But we have to look at, as I said, I was born in Cuba. I left when I was 10 years old. I can tell you firsthand what it was like to live in communist Cuba. I used to come home every night and tell my parents, this happened, and they would tell me, please, Millie, stop. Shut up, you're going to get us arrested, because I've always been very, very vocal about how I felt, even when I was a child. So I know that there are lots and lots of human rights violations going on. But the politics in the last 50-something years have not worked. They have not worked. But we have now Carlos Saladrigas with his microloan program. 1,200 individuals have received funding so they can give food. Yeah. I mean, put food on their tables.
Also, let me point out that neither Carlos Saladrigas nor Mike Fernandez or any of the prominent, there are a dozen or so prominent Miami businessmen, Cuban Americans, who are trying to encourage entrepreneurship in Cuba, and none of them is going to do business in Cuba. There is no personal profit here. They just think they want to help the Cuban people.
And maybe that's true, but forgive me, I don't have the confidence in a President Obama to go and draw the line in the sand, because lines in the sand from this administration.
But that's politics.
Hang on,
That's politics. That's not reality. I'm sorry. He's governing.
This is all about politics. And so you cannot wipe away 50 or 60 years worth of human rights abuses, harboring fugitives in Cuba, totally killing people. You know, come on, you cannot wipe that away in one fell swoop.
Speaking of politics, we have a lot to talk about in local politics, and we're going to do that on the roundtable when we come right back.
On the Sunday morning, live in our studio, we are in the midst of our roundtable with Ed Pizzoli, Henry Crespo, Millie Herrera. Let's talk a little presidential politics. I know you all want to do this. I do, certainly. And this week, I did not see it, but thankfully Glenna did. She saw Stephen Colbert did a vicious little number on Marco Rubio after he had dropped out. So here is a bit of what Colbert had to say.
So for the record, Florida votes yes on Jimmy Buffett, yes on releasing pythons into toilets. On Marco Rubio, no thanks.
So for anyone who hasn't seen the Hunger Games, that's what that getup was. It was a little skit. But wait, you know, yes to pythons, oh Florida, hashtag oh Florida. What happens to Marco Rubio now? It sounded, Ed, listening to his speech, it wasn't a concession speech as much as a suspension speech, but it sounds like he's not much into the political world for his future anymore.
Well, let's put it in perspective on a personal level. He has a young family, a beautiful family, and a bright future, but he's been through a year's worth of high-pressure presidential politics. I think he needs and deserves the time with his family next 60, 90 days when things settle down and he can think clearer, and I would give him that time before we see.
Ed, where did the Rubio campaign go wrong? It started off with real optimism and hope, and about 3 weeks ago, whenever that Houston debate was, when he ridiculed Donald Trump's spray tan and you know, the other thing about the hands and so forth. I mean, it just took a nosedive right there.
Yeah, I'm not so sure that the Rubio, you can point on things like you mentioned about what he did wrong, but I think you cannot fight a wave. And so what you have in Trump or even Cruz is an outsider set of angry Republicans who do not like where the country is, who truly do not like the establishment and want to change the game completely. They're totally unsatisfied with what Washington is providing the American people. And so with respect to that, I would say it's less about what Marco Rubio did wrong, but more about trying to fight against the current.
I think Marco Rubio is wrong the moment he filed to run. He was not ready for prime time. I think that him filing against his mentor and the way that he attacked Jeb Bush was like a death sentence for him. He did not have the gravitas, he did not have the experience. Remember, he's been running for office all his life. He really doesn't have experience in the private sector. Yeah. Well, you know, exactly. And, you know, him saying that he's not running for vice president, that he's not running for governor, yeah, right. Yeah, right. I have a Brooklyn bridge to sell him. And
he might buy it.
I don't know. I think
what do you think, Henry? 2018, do you think that, in fact, Rubio may say, hey, maybe a governor is something I'd like to do?
Well, look, I think when he ran for office, he ran on the wave of this anti-Obama movement that the Republican Party has done a good job in making Obama the boogeyman. But the reality is that he got a taste of what conservatism is about. These conservatives, people that are dominating the party. But to your point, Ed, who do they blame? Do they blame Obama? Really? But listen, when you go to one of these states, you have the city councilman is a Republican. The county commissioner is a Republican. The congressman is a Republican. The U.S. senator is a Republican. The state rep is a Republican. The state senator is a Republican. And the governor is a Republican.
What city you're thinking about,
no,
but
it's
it's
all
not
across
so monolithic
Kansas. No,
here.
Most of these people that are coming to the Trump rallies that are upset and representing the heartland of America is happening in the Republican primary, and they are represented by Republicans that are not.
So then where does Rubio's support
but these
go?
are angry people. These are angry people who haven't voted
Wow.
before, a lot of them, or they haven't voted in a long time.
But they're affected
But
in
look,
their communities and in their counties.
You're ignoring the results from Florida. We all agree that Florida is a very diverse state, different regions, different economic interests.
Sure.
But he took 48% of the Republican vote and basically drummed everybody else in that race but for in Dade County. And so when you take 66 of 67 counties, there is a message in there, and it's not necessarily about Marco Rubio. It was about what Donald Trump is speaking to and the anger that,
Is he
against the establishment.
Because I don't know what he's speaking to,
Well,
other than vulgarity, other than hatred, other than bigotry, other than just sheer nonsense. What is he talking about? I mean, what are his real policies?
Going to make America great again.
Well, America is great. It has never stopped being great. I don't know if anybody has lived outside of this country, but let me tell you, we are great.
He's speaking to the corruption that is, say, example, like an FBI investigation about emails. He's speaking to the Clinton Foundation. Hang on, no, listen. He's speaking to, listen, no. He's speaking to the insider game that is Washington, and the American people, by the way, it's just not Republicans. It's just not, listen, 200,000 people in Florida switched to be Republican to vote in the primary. That is a very bad sign. When Republicans outnumber Democrats of the people who participated in the primary in Florida, that's again a very bad sign. You're missing the basic
political
point.
talking points, and the Republicans are been in charge in Washington, in Congress with the majority, have done nothing other than try to repeal Obama.
10 seconds.
Who he's speaking to is the pops that punched the young man going up the stairs, sucker punched him, right? And then says he doesn't condone violence, but he's paying for his legal fees. That's who he's speaking to the heartland of America.
A good point on which to end. Ed, Henry, and Millie, great to have you come. Come back again. We'd love to have you.
This is what they call a robust roundtable.
No, this is good. I love it.
All right, coming up, why would more than 3 million voters sit out the Florida primary? Well, because they had no choice. Details when we come back.
Good afternoon, South Florida. Still pretty gloomy out there, but we've had a bit of a break in the clouds, so temperatures warming up already to those low 80s. Some of us getting into those mid 80s. By the way, the models are still showing that showers will once again develop through this afternoon and into the evening. There could still be a few showers left over, but that cold front arriving tonight is going to bring our temperatures down. By tomorrow morning, we're waking up to the low 60s along the coast. Could see temperatures in the 50s inland with a high of only 70 degrees Monday.
Jennifer, thanks. You know, we spend a lot of time talking about the right and the responsibility of casting your vote and the fight to do so freely and fairly. And that's why it feels kind of odd to say I did not vote in Tuesday's presidential primary. Neither did Michael. And chances are you didn't either. More than 3.25 million Florida voters had no say in choosing the man or woman we'd like to see run for president because we choose to have no party affiliation. Florida is one of a dozen or so states with a completely closed primary. No way for independents or unaffiliated voters to participate in presidential preferences. There are reasons for this, and all benefit the two big parties. Democrats and Republicans may say, well, why should people with no allegiance to our parties have a say about our nominees? All right, fair enough. The parties run the primaries and they make the rules. But the parties don't pay for them. We all do. From the polling stations to the process to the tally, we pay, but we can't play. But even more important, opening Florida's primary would force candidates to focus less on party politics and focus more on convincing every voter why they're worthy. We saw that happen in real time in states as different as New Hampshire and South Carolina. Candidates were on the ground for weeks there before those open primaries, working to meet and talk to all voters, and they were accountable on issues important to everyone. In Florida, unaffiliated voters are on track to become a third of the electorate. Nationally, some 4 in 10 Americans reject party labels. So what are the chances for an open primary in Florida? Well, none at the moment, since the change would be up to the state legislature, which means we're relying on those who have the least to gain from it. An effort to get a constitutional amendment on the state ballot didn't get enough signatures this year, but maybe after this primary, it'll get more attention for the 2018 cycle. There are certainly enough independent voices to make it happen. So what do you think?
Open primary.
Yeah, we invite you to weigh in on that or any topic you like.
And you can get us by email, Facebook, Twitter, all of those. We love hearing from you. Stay informed, get involved. Have a great Sunday. Well done. I'm glad that you said that.